Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Before you can kill them? Where's the moral mystery? We'll find out anyway after 11. Let's start now with Brexit. It's so hard to know where to start now. I'm going to make a really, really conscious effort to make a warm and welcoming platform this morning for absolutely everybody. I'm tempted to disallow one contribution to the question I'm about to ask. I don't think necessarily you should be allowed to say, let's call the whole thing off. I don't know that that's helpful. I also worry that that would perhaps become the kind of bombardment response to the question of how do we improve the current situation? How do we improve the current situation? I'll see whether or not that ambition is tenable. Because two things happened yesterday that were frankly remarkable. I mean, truly remarkable. We're already living in a country where the Foreign Secretary can personally imperil a British citizen jailed by a hostile regime and keep his job. I mean, that is, seriously, think about it for a moment, that is beyond belief. Boris Johnson writing in The Sun yesterday in defence of what he called press freedom with regard to campaigns pointing out to advertisers some of the toxicity that is punted by the newspapers they advertise in. That's upset Boris Johnson and his commitment to press freedom. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll have seen that I've dug out the old story about him agreeing to help an old school friend get the address of a journalist that the old school friend wanted to get beaten up for doing journalism. Funny how that man's moral compass just goes haywire at the vaguest opportunity. So we've got that. He's Foreign Secretary, also, of course, a prominent Brexit campaigner. But it was actually the Chancellor and the Brexit Secretary who beggared belief yesterday. The Chancellor admitted that the Cabinet has never had a conversation yet. They haven't actually reached any agreement on what the destination is, what they're hoping to achieve. That in the context of a democracy, that's incredible. I know that Brexit is a distorting lens that renders almost everything that we examine through it unrecognisable, or there's a degree of irrationality attached to the whole debate that is, it's a little bit baffling. It's not completely baffling, but the idea that the Cabinet hasn't got an agreed position, a negotiating tactic that has an end game in sight, or what's the word I'm looking for? An objective. They haven't got one. They haven't agreed on what they're going to try to, what their priorities are, or anything. It's almost unbelievable. What on earth has been happening in the 18 months since we voted, and indeed since the 6 months since we triggered Article 50? David Davis doesn't seem to have done anything, and he yesterday, of course. He lied. Either he lied yesterday or he lied when he said there were 58 impact assessments underway. These are not matters of opinion. These are matters of fact. The Select Committee, which voted on whether or not he was in contempt of Parliament, 10 Tory MPs and 1 DUP voted to say no. Everybody else voted to say yes. It's just so tribal and nuts now that some of the most fundamental tenets of democracy are disappearing before our very eyes. And people who ostensibly voted to leave the European Union because they felt that we weren't properly democratic, in my view wrongly, but that's not a fight we're going to have today. They're cheering the slow dismantling of many of our democratic principles. Accountability, ministerial responsibility. Even parliamentary sovereignty is going for a song at the moment. So those two, Philip Hammond admitting there's no plan, David Davis essentially revealing that he hasn't done anything since he got the job. What would you do if the Chancellor stood up and said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z? And then we said, why? And he said, I don't know. Have you done any research? Have you done any impact assessments? Have you done any analysis? Have you done any economic modelling? Have you? So when you've given us your spending plans, Chancellor, have you done any research into how much money you're likely to have next year? No. The arrogance of David Davis it's almost preternatural. And I speak as quite an arrogant person, so I'm conscious of what the signs are. It's incredible to see a man so utterly ignorant of facts leading this country towards a destination that hasn't even been determined. No opinion yet from me, just facts. He, thanks to the Chancellor, doesn't have a target. There is no agreed policy platform. There is no agreed priority or objective. So he has spent 18 months essentially doing nothing. Bernard Jenkin, a prominent Leave campaigner who appeared elsewhere this morning, suggested that the interviewer he was talking to should get the EU into the studio and ask them why they can't start trade negotiations. Apparently utterly ignorant of the fact that the only tangible thing David Davis has done in this job is agree to the sequencing that the European Union insisted on. You remember, the European Union said very simply, we can't start talking about trade until you've settled all your current obligations, until we've worked out what's going to happen to citizens living in both future territories and the question of the Irish border. David Davis said it would be the row of the summer, and it was over before the first swallow of summer had appeared. Bernard Jenkin goes on the BBC this morning, live to millions and millions of people, and either pretends not to know this, or displays his ignorance of it. The one simple fact of the Brexit process so far is that David Davis agreed to the sequencing. There's nothing in Article 50 about sequencing. It was a European Union requirement. Because as one German politician has said this morning, this is not a negotiation. This is the European Union 27 countries essentially deciding what we will be allowed in the context of a deal, which makes it easier slightly to understand the question that some people respond to, the idea that some people have been persuaded we should somehow call the whole thing off, i.e. the negotiation off, and leave without any deal in place or without any negotiation. As Philip Hammond said yesterday, that we'd still have to pay, because who's going to sign a trade deal with someone that doesn't meet the requirements of the last one they were in? It's nuts, guys. It's really, really nuts. And yet, still it continues. So, I don't know whether or not it's feasible to say you're not allowed to ring in if you just want to stop it, call the whole thing off and remain in the European Union. I'd love some constructive ideas. Here's the really horrible thought. If it becomes inevitable, if it becomes absolutely unstoppable, if this notion gets traction that a tiny little very, very small majority, 52, less than 52 to just over 48, if we really still have to be enslaved to the notion that is permanent and binding. And it was Owen Paterson yesterday, wasn't it? We found the clip of him saying there's no way voting to leave means leaving the single market. That would be mad. And we found it. And then he said to Nick, 17.4 million people definitely voted to leave the single market. And the lies are demonstrable. I don't know if they're lies. It's delusion. It's delusion or deceit or just dumbness, I'm afraid. I can't think of a kinder word to use. So the evidence is incontrovertible. It's all there. This is not, I haven't said an opinion yet. All I've said so far is recorded historical fact. They say one thing, then they say the other. And they're in charge. That perhaps is the most dispiriting observation of all. They're in charge of an incredibly difficult and complex process, which one of their key players, Liam Fox, described as the easiest deal in history. Even Jeremy Corbyn managed to land a punch and raise a laugh in the House of Commons yesterday by reminding the Prime Minister of what her International Trade Secretary said. So just think about this. Just if you can, don't do this if you're driving. Forget all about Brexit, okay? Just forget all about Brexit and focus on any one of the elements I've just said. But let's have a little look at Liam Fox, because we haven't talked about him much. So here is the man who is in charge of negotiating all of our hopefully imminent trade deals. So come March 2019, when we're out and we're free to start trade, no matter that neither him nor Davis understood before the referendum that they weren't allowed to do it until we'd actually left. Let's just forgive them that. Let's park that. If I'm not allowed to say stop Brexit, I'm definitely not calling in today, James. Are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot on this one? I don't know. So, just to focus on Liam Fox, and again, no opinion from me yet, just fact. the man who will be in charge of negotiating all of the trade deals which the Leave lobby insist the rest of the world will be queuing up to sign, okay? He thought that the deal David Davis is currently trying to do would be the easiest in history. So if you were to look at Liam Fox's public pronouncements in search of evidence of his ability to understand trade deals and negotiation, that would be where you'd start. Let's have a look at his record. What does he know about trade deals? What's he ever said about? Oh, here you go. Here he is describing the withdrawal negotiations as the easiest in human history, or the trade deal that would follow as the easiest in human history. And it is almost unspeakably hard. He doesn't know his proverbial from his proverbial, does he? And he's in charge. David Davis, 58 impact assessments the Prime Minister has started reading. Yesterday, there are no impact assessments. It's incredible. It's incredible. And the only thing I don't get is what you do now if you are still persuaded that this is a really good idea. The only thing I don't get is when I present this to you, almost unadorned by analysis, simple record, simple history, simple fact, about the individuals in charge, I don't really understand how anybody could be comfortable still sitting in the car that they're driving. Even if you love that, you still love the car. Is this analogy going to work? You're still delighted with the car. You just think it's been driven by an idiot, but you're determined to stay in the back seat. What's going on? 0345 60 60973. Because every single thing I've just said has happened. There is not one iota of opinion, really, in anything that I've just said. These two men, David Davis and Liam Fox, have done all of the things I've just described, and Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, yesterday revealed that the Cabinet hasn't got a Brexit position. And still, we plough onwards. Why? I don't know why. So, I don't know that it's going to work to suggest that you're not allowed to say we should call off Brexit. But if you want to call off negotiations and walk away, I can see that position is what some corners of the public are being softened up for. That would be like, after you've cut your nose off to spite your face, you then ask someone to knee you in the ghoulies. I mean, it is just unbelievably masochistic and self-damaging. But I've got a horrible feeling that unless we can start answering these questions, like how can you have so much evidence that these clowns don't know what they're doing but still want them to do it, unless we can get a better understanding of that, I suspect that we'll just double down on the daftness, won't we? And we will then, because no one's prepared to admit they've made a terrible mistake. They can't. There's too much ego involved. Then, in order to sort of filibuster, to postpone reality for a little bit longer, we will end up walking away with no deal. And if World Trade Organization rules come in overnight, you need a border in Ireland, a hard border. You need customs checks, which blows up the Good Friday Agreement, which perhaps, to stretch the metaphor a little far, will mean that terrorists start blowing up people again. It's 10:17. Interesting news developing with the Electoral Commission confirming that they are investigating momentum for potential breaches of campaign financing rules during the 2017 election. We may catch up with that story with Theo a little later, but we look now, as is inevitable. I appreciate that some people would rather we didn't, because, ignorance is bliss. But we look now at what on earth we think is going to happen next. We've got a Brexit secretary who has misled the House of Commons and the British public. Every single prominent Leave campaigner has been shown, pretty much every single one. I don't know that Rees-Mogg, to be fair to the fella, has actively or actually contradicted himself. But remember, he's not in a position of responsibility. He doesn't have to deliver. But all of the rest of them have. And the Cabinet doesn't have a position. To show you how nuts things have become. Where's that text just gone from Richard? I've lost it. That's annoying. I just thought I have no... Here, this is from Richard. Relax, James. We don't need a Brexit position. Once we're out, we can rebuild. Don't forget that the EU need us as much as we need them. I am 50-50 on whether that is a joke or a serious contribution. It's not a criticism, Richard. It's a reflection of how confused I am. I have no... Because we use a line like that, they need us as much as we need them, but just... Is that an echo of the nonsense that was spouted before the vote? When they said they need us much more than we need them, which was palpably absurd, or is that genuinely the position that you've moved to now? I don't know. Milan is in Chiswick. Hello, Milan. How are you?
I'm good, James. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, but you're not allowed to ring in and say that we should stay in the European Union. You know that, don't you?
Okay. Well, what I will say is that is this a surprise? Because I remember Sir Ivan Rogers quitting around December, January, because he was just saying the government's position on this is muddled and all over the place.
He is the former British ambassador to the European Union.
Yeah, and there were reports that he was just trying to get sense out of Theresa May and David Davis, and they were just all over the place. And
I think his position became untenable. And it's a good point to pick. There's probably several in the rearview mirror, but the point at which the bloke who probably knew more about negotiating with the European Union than anybody else in the country, let alone the government, the point at which he said that they haven't got a Scooby-Doo should have been the point at which everybody took notice. But of course we didn't, or they didn't, or the country didn't.
No, and I've listened to LBC a lot, and there's a lot of leaders who get offended when you say that they don't understand Brexit, they don't understand what they're voting for.
Well, we don't need to offend people listening. And I miss the days when they had the confidence to phone me. But the point is, we don't need to offend them. We can just point out that David Davis has either dissembled or deceived the House, and that Liam Fox's understanding of international trade deals is probably best encapsulated by his claim that the trade deal with the European Union would be the easiest in human history. I mean, you don't need to offend ordinary voters. You just look at their leaders and tell truths. And that is where you don't understand why the penny still doesn't drop for so many. What is it that they see that you don't see?
And also, I don't know, I think it's a lack of understanding, because let's walk away with no deal. That can't happen, because both sides...
I think it can, mate.
They can't, because the status quo won't remain, because people...
No, but look, because you're being rational, and you're being rational while describing a catalogue of irrationality. Do you see what I mean? So I think no deal can easily happen. I think it would be absolutely disastrous, but of course it can happen. I can't actually see what else can happen, because whatever deal we are offered, nobody's going to be happy with it. Nobody is going to be able to say we'll be better off than we were before. You're just going to hear these ludicrous arguments about red tape. And let me find one. I'll just have a quick look at my Twitter feed. Here you go. Here's one. This is from James. We leaving, moron. 18 months and still winging. The EU is corrupt and inept. They can't sort an issue out without a lunch 3 weeks after the event, like the migration issue, and they rolled over for Turkey, didn't they? Great negotiating. £3 billion it cost. So you provide evidence to somebody that every single person in control of the Brexit process is either daft or dangerous, and forgive me if you are a leaver and you don't feel represented by James, but that's the kind of response that you'll get. So no deal could easily happen.
Again, when I try and explain it to leaders, again, a no deal means you can't go back. What happens to airlines? What happens to radioactive materials? What happens to borders?
Project Fear, mate.
Oh, yeah. But this is the thing, where if we debate Brexit, we're I'm a traitor, and I'm talking the country down.
Yeah,
which
that's
is
it.
bizarre.
No, you must stop describing things, because that is talking the country down.
I apologise.
That's all right. That's all right. Milan, take care. Give my love to your mum. Mystery there for people listening. 27 minutes after 10 is the time. Jake is in Andover. Jake, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
How you doing?
I'm all right.
I'm pretty depressed about the whole thing, to be honest. I work a European role, so I've worked a European role for a number of years, and well, firstly, I'm fed up going into Europe, and I just have people smirk at me and laugh at me, and sort of generally sort of ridicule the whole Brexit situation. And then, the first question on their lips is, which way did you vote? And they all kind of think it's quite amusing that we've all sort of up and left. Some of them find it quite distressing. One of my colleagues in Holland said it was like, we're all playing a football match, and we're winning this football match, and then halfway through the game, half the team walk off, and we're on our own now. And that's the way some people in Europe feel. But
Is there any point asking what we could do now to continue on the path to leaving, but just to make things better than they currently are? Or is that me again trying to bring a rational analysis to an essentially emotional issue?
Well, I think that the only way to do it is you know what I feel. The fact is we shouldn't. I know you don't want me to say it, but we shouldn't be leaving, and we should stop it all right now. I'm sorry I said that, but if we're going to go ahead with this, then we have really got to go cap in hand to Europe, because they are the 27.
But that is that is such a recipe for disaster on every level. Talk about a democratic deficit. All of these people who thought that we were going to be better off and we'd stop paying money, we're going to have to pay money to access a market without any say whatsoever in the regulations and the rules that market operates under.
Well, it's as simple as this. Everybody says, for instance, with a drop in the pound, okay? The drop in the pound...
Doesn't matter, it's good for exports.
It's good for exports. They said,
well... So people who don't really understand what that phrase even means, but they've heard someone else say it, and they'll just keep repeating it, just like they heard someone else say we can't control our borders, or they heard someone else say Brussels makes 75% of our laws, or they heard someone else say uncontrolled masses. They don't know what these phrases mean, they just keep repeating them, and it doesning matter how clever you are.
Here's the other side of it, James. Here's the other side of it. The British division of my company, when the pound lost at 15%, 15-20% over a few days, and then it's sort of settled around 15% loss now. Okay, the prices for buying NHS equipment, okay, into the country, which is done in the US dollar, went up by 15-20% overnight.
So that's NHS spending. That's the NHS budget. That's taking a bite out of the NHS budget. But Project Fear.
So where does most of the equipment for the NHS come from? It comes from either Europe or America. Anyway, it's certainly abroad. Okay, so the loss in the pound means that actually for most of the goods we're paying in the NHS, it's gone up by 15-20% already. With regard to the exports, we're going to, exports...
No, I'm not. I hear you, but I'm not going to delay the news any longer for this exercise in breaking the only rule I've imposed on the programme today, Jake, because you haven't got a clue about how we can make the current situation better, have you?
Nobody knows, do they?
No, that's rubbish, David. David Davis knows. Yes.
But we've got to revolt for that. We've got to revolt. We've got to resist. And at the moment, the people that want to remain, the groups that want to remain, as far as I'm concerned, they're too fragmented. They need to get themselves together. They need to find a leader, get organised.
Well, Nick Clegg's made that observation, and some have suggested he might be the man to provide that leadership, but I'm not convinced. We need a king across the water. Who it is, I do not know. But we're not doing that. We're not looking for the king across the water. We're looking at what we could do to improve the current situation. And maybe that's an impossible question to answer, because if you understand the current situation properly, you can't see any way it could be improved, which means that people who don't understand it will once again be in charge, and that will lead us to the catastrophic prospect of no deal. 10:31. To make this situation better, currently would be Theresa May stepping down and taking the country back to a general election. The new government can then request an extension of time for negotiations and get someone who actually knows what they're doing in charge of the negotiations. It's a thought, I suppose, but, that's a rock and a hard place for those of us who feel politically homeless at the moment. Spike writes, OK, my mind has been changed. We should stay in the EU, especially since the far-right parties are gaining influence throughout Europe. I don't know whether that means that you want to be in Europe because you like the far-right parties, or whether because you think the best way to fight them is together. I took an amazing call yesterday from Harry, who wants to leave the European Union because he sees the European Union as dancing more to the tune of sort of fascistic politics, where my position is the polar opposite. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Just because all the far right in this country want to leave the European Union doesn't necessarily mean that Harry was wrong yesterday when he suggested that actually the European Union will end up dancing more to that tune than sort of, if you like, liberalism. We are where we are. 26th of May for me. 26th of May 2016, the point at which the world began to diverge The point at which it wasn't really a political argument anymore. The point at which the evidence began to mount that these people didn't know what they were doing. David Davis on Twitter, and he's still not deleted it. So that arrogance is quite incredible. The first calling point of the UK's negotiator immediately after Brexit will not be Brussels, it will be Berlin to strike a deal. David Davis displaying in that single tweet that he didn't know the most basic rule of EU trade negotiations, which is that individual countries cannot negotiate with third countries. You can only negotiate as a whole. Donald Trump, according to Angela Merkel, had to be told this 12 or 13 times. And she visited him and he said, we're going to do a deal with Germany. And she said, you can't. You can only do a deal with the European Union. We're going to do a deal with Germany. You can't. 12 or 13 times. But even he understood it after a dozen explanations and concluded by saying, OK, we'll do a deal with the European Union then. Completely blowing up the prospect of us being in any way first in line. The interview that Michael Gove did with Donald Trump, the one that Rupert Murdoch sat in on, but Mr. Gove decided that wasn't a detail that needed to be shared with readers of the Times. Even as he was leaving, he tried to get Donald Trump to say, we'll be at the front of the queue, won't we? We'll be at the front of the queue, won't we? But Michael Gove failed even to secure that promise from the president. But that 26th of May tweet, the first calling point of the UK's negotiator immediately after Brexit, will not be Brussels, it will be Berlin to strike a deal, displays abject ignorance of how it works. And I have a horrible feeling that in the ensuing 18 months or so, his understanding of the issues has not increased one jot. So cheer me up. I mean, what needs to happen now to make the situation better? Okay, how do we improve the Brexit process? I'm not going to ban you from saying we have to call the whole thing off because that would be restrictive, but I'd much rather speak to people who think there is still a way ahead that will render us in a better position than we were before. Tim is in Little Brington in Northamptonshire. Tim, what would you like to say?
Well, I'd like to try and cheer you up. I do agree with you that our politicians are inept. I think that's a facet of the way our political elite move into politics without any real experience of real life. But from my perspective,
Liam Fox was a doctor. David Davis was an SAS reservist. I mean,
when I say real life, I mean commerce and business and
Philip Hammond has made several fortunes in various different fields. I don't like the sweeping generaliser. There's some brilliant politicians out there. The ones in charge of Brexit and the ones who called for it are inept. The rest of them are right.
I was agreeing with you.
Yes.
Right. So the attempt to cheer you up is on the basis of experience of trading in EU, US, China, all over the globe. And the only point I wanted to make was that trade is not actually done by politicians and trade deals. Trade, there's an unstoppable trend towards globalization. And we can all see the internet is doing that in the basic stuff that we buy, but in all trade, globalization is an unstoppable march, and trade is done by businesses and individuals and companies and
according to rules set by government.
But not by government.
No, the governments make the rules.
The governments make the rules, but all that happens if you don't have a trade deal is that there's slightly more complex process to get to it. We don't actually have a trade deal with the US, do we? Because
no, but we have a system of understandings and accommodations.
Okay, well, if you let me run through the process, we don't have a trade deal with the US, and the EU's been unable to agree one for 19 years. However, we sell a lot of stuff to the US. The US sells a lot of stuff to Europe. It's not a major hassle for me to ship technology products or services over to the US. It's not a major hassle for me to buy them from the US. It's not a major. We don't actually have a trade deal with China. It's not a major hassle for them to be the world's biggest trading nation. So all I'm saying is that although it is looking really sort of terribly depressing that we can't do these global deals, all that would happen if we don't do them is the trade will carry on. It always has.
It'll just cost more.
It'll be slightly more complex.
Yes, but you're supposed to be telling me how things are going to be better than they were before. And you're saying they're going to be worse, but maybe not that much worse. Which I agree, in the current climate, that counts as good news.
I don't think it's going to change massively whether we do a deal or not do a deal, because so many jobs in every country are dependent on trade that nobody wants to stop dealing with one another. It's not like we don't love each other anymore.
Oh, well, that's not the message that the German car industry have delivered to Angela Merkel, is it?
Well, the German Chambers of Commerce delivered a message to Angela Merkel that they desperately wanted to do a deal with the UK because...
But not one that would prioritise their position over the political union. They were specific and explicit that the integrity of the European Union was more important than the short-term damage to their economic interests. They understood that because, unlike you, and I'm not arguing with you, but unlike you, they think that trade deals are really important. And if they're not really important, as you are suggesting, why does everybody want them?
I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying that there's no point being massively depressed at the thought that a trade deal may not be done, or a good trade deal or a bad trade deal, because basically the trade will carry on.
I grant you that. That's fine. No, that's all good. Hang on a second. I just want to clarify one thing. Obviously, the world doesn't grind to a halt. But do you think people would have voted for a platform that said things are going to be worse, hopefully not too much worse?
I genuinely believe, I've got an economic background, I genuinely believe that over a 7-10 year horizon, we will actually be better off out of the EU.
Yeah, so do you think if you'd said to people you're going to be worse off for a decade, they would have voted for you?
I didn't vote to leave.
No, but I'm asking if that was the platform, if we were going to, because this is what I'm hearing now, it's going to be a 5 to 10 year window.
I think you and I both know that there were, and I don't want to get into any sort of right-wing, left-wing debate, but there were many nuances. I live in Northamptonshire. I suspect that probably my region voted heavily to leave, and one of the reasons for that has been the changing nature of the town centre and the changing demographic. And that may be an ignorance, but it's an undeniable fact that it was causing a lot of concern to many people. But the changing demographic as a result of the
foreign people, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, and is that what we're always going to end with? So when we say the only answer that essentially addresses all of the questions I ask, which is how can this not matter? How can you be ignoring that? How can you think he has any grasp of the facts? All we're going to end up with eventually is either don't worry, things will get worse, but they might get better in a decade, or immigration.
No. You're putting words into my mouth.
I apologise.
You said, would people have voted for Brexit if they thought there would be a period of economic disruption or there was an improvement? And I said economics was not the main...
No, I see. No, you're quite right. I understand and I agree with you. There must be. I just don't know how many of them there are, Tim. The people who would say, I don't mind being worse off as long as we can get rid of some immigrants.
But I think the problem is we're in uncharted territory, okay? So we might have been worse off by staying in the EU. Economics is not a science. If there had been what this has done for the EU.
I'm late for the news. I'm late for the break. Give me a crucial point in a nutshell.
We could have had another Greece, a Portugal, Spain, or Italy. Remember the pigs definition? If we'd had one of those, we would have been, and if we still have one of those, then undoubtedly we'd be better off out because we wouldn't have to bail out the euro, and that's economic fact.
But it's not an economic fact because, as you said yourself, it's not. Economics is not a science, and arguably the protections that we're given by European trading regulations, even when we're doing the trade that you described with America and China, provide us with a bigger benefit than the cost of bailing out other economies when they need help. But that is, as you actually said yourself, that's a matter of conflicting opinion or analysis. It's never a matter of fact because economics is not, as you just said, a science. So I don't want to put more words in Tim's mouth, but I think he's probably right. Obviously, the world's not going to grind to a halt, but there's a reason why all governments prioritise trade deals, from Donald Trump right down to tiny little countries. They all want to do trade deals because it means that you can sell more stuff. Very, very simply put, the trade-off is that you also buy more stuff from people who also want to sell more stuff. And then that word, which we haven't used on the programme in ages, actually, immigration, I don't know how big a balloon that still is. Problem is that if people's concerns about immigration have calmed down a bit because the newspapers haven't been poking the tiger quite as much recently, then all that needs to happen is for the newspapers to start poking the tiger again. Because, as we saw, it was not the areas with highest immigration that reported the biggest desire to leave the European Union. It wasn't London or Manchester. It was Middle England, if you will, or as some people insist on calling it, Little England, but I don't like that. 10:47 is the time. And lots of people claim that it wasn't about immigration, but I think Tim is right, that when it really boils down to the dust of the deal, people who have profound concerns about immigration will probably be the ones most likely to say, I don't care if it hurts, we're going to do something about that. And that maybe is why people like me are wasting our time. Although a couple of people have pointed out I like this. The same people who say they can't have a debate about immigration without being called a racist turn out to be exactly the same people who say that you should stop talking the country down whenever anybody starts questioning Brexit. It's a little bit hypocritical. I don't think you win any prizes for spotting that, Gary, but I enjoyed it. 10:52 is the time. Billy's on the Isle of Wight. Billy, what's going on?
Hello, good morning.
Hello, Billy.
James, good to speak to you. I'm actually probably one of the rarities here. I did vote to leave the European Union, but I think that we need one simple solution, and that's to deal with this problem by approaching it in a non-partisan way, because it's an absolute disgrace what David Davis has come out with over the last 24 hours.
Yes.
And, you know, at the moment, I mean, I was saying to your producer a minute ago, I think it just shows that now we have to go back to the drawing board yet again. And I think the only way we're going to be able to go back to the drawing board in a sensible way is by having people like Nicky Morgan, for example. I know she's a Remainer, but I was listening to her the other day on LBC. I think she was speaking to Ian Dale.
Yes.
And she is very intelligent. She's an ex-minister. We need people like that at the top table.
Was she one of the mutineers? Was she one of the saboteurs? I can't remember, because that's part of the problem. You know, during my introduction, I very nearly said, but I didn't because I thought it would pop too many heads. But I very nearly said the only way we can get out of this mess is to get some of the sensible people on the other side of the debate to help pull the bus back from the brink of the cliff, and that's essentially what you're saying. But why should they? That's the other problem, because they're still clinging, whether they admit it in public or not, to the notion, and you won't like the way I phrase this, but they're still clinging to the notion that the nation might come to its senses and call the whole thing off.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nicky Morgan did actually refrain from saying that, but
yes, she has to.
As you say. Yeah, she has to, otherwise she's going to be called an enemy of the people or whatever.
Well, she was one of the mutineers, apparently, so she's already being targeted and abused by newspapers owned by billionaires who do want Brexit to go ahead.
Yeah, and of course this is the problem, because what they're doing, I mean, this is why I think they need to get round the table together, and why it needs to be similar to the format of a select committee, because these people are quite frankly brave to stick their head above and say, look, this is what I think. And at the end of the day, Nicky Morgan doesn't necessarily want to stop Brexit. I think she would love to, but what she wants is a sensible deal. And
I think that's the next stage is probably close to what you describe, isn't it? Is some sort of people like her and possibly like me to accept the inevitability of it. But the problem with that is that to accept the inevitability of it, people like you need to say, yeah, we are actually going to be worse in most measurable ways in the short term, hopefully not in the long term, but I can't prove that. I can, however, prove that we're going to have a weaker pound, a weaker economy, fewer people wanting to come and work here as the population gets older, and weaker trading relationships, at least in the short term. If people like you say that and also say sorry, then maybe people like Nicky Morgan will help dig the country out of the hole that you've put it in.
See, this is where I differ a little bit.
I thought you might, Billy.
Of course, with me, I really think, I mean, it'd probably be helpful if I explain why I voted to leave. I mean, I was after a change, you know. Yes. I wasn't after, stopping immigration or sovereignty as quite often a lot of people use to justify their case. And that's why I voted to leave. And I think what we need is really, go back to the drawing board. We need people like Nicky Morgan, and we need people like, another good example is Frank Skinner. People who are...
Frank Skinner?
At the grass. Sorry, not Frank Skinner.
I could do a better job than David Davis, especially if you got Badil involved. They could have it all sorted by tea time.
Who's the one I'm thinking about? The one that was a minor?
Dennis Skinner.
Dennis Skinner. He's
kind of like a Benite. lever, isn't he, I think?
Yes, yeah, we need people like that, because the thing is, what I'm after, I suppose, James, is I'm probably after a soft Brexit.
Yes.
If that's how I was to describe it, because what I'm after, I would like to stay in the single market. I think that's a great thing for our economy and for our country, and therefore I don't think we should just cut off all ties with the world and be our own island.
Briefly, Billy, what change were you hoping to effect by your vote then? If you don't have problems with immigration and you like being in the single market and you don't buy into this nebulous notion that sovereignty is somehow fetishised, what change were you hoping to bring about, my friend?
I suppose what I was after when I was voting, I suppose it's similar to, I suppose the best way to put it is a bit like applying for a new job. What I was after, I wasn't necessarily after changing the entire way that my life works, but I was after that freedom simply to move around and shuffle a little bit. So by not being in the European Union, the way I looked at it from my perspective was that actually what we would get is we would allow ourselves just that flexibility to say, walk away if they do come up with something disastrous and it's not going to work. So essentially, we've got that entire veto, really. That's how I looked at it.
So, well, this is what I think, and again, we're doing that thing of being rational, aren't we? Because it seems to me that by all means, the vote was delivered, albeit it was much closer than I think anybody would have wanted. If it had been 60-40 in favour of leaving, I think it would be a lot easier to process. But this is what we did, without really knowing much about it, and now we know a lot more. It's almost like we've had a look, and now we can decide whether we're going to buy it or not. But what I don't understand are the people that have said, now you've had a look, you absolutely have to stick to the opinion that you had when you didn't know as much about the issue as you do now. And that I find a little bit frightening.
Yes, yeah, and that I think I have to agree with you on, James, because if there was a referendum or there was another one that was announced,
yes,
I was very prominent within my group. I wasn't sort of, prominent elsewhere, but no. I was a very loud sort of, Brexiteer amongst my group of friends who tended to vote Remain. But I think if the vote happened again, I absolutely agree with you. I would probably be a quiet spectator. And I would have a better opportunity to take in the facts and consider perhaps whether what David Cameron is saying, or it would be Theresa May on this occasion, I would have to consider whether what she was saying was right. Because you could
look at some evidence rather than predictions and speculations.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Do you know what we should have done? We should have done 58 impact assessment reports before the referendum.
Precisely. That is absolutely the pinnacle of what we should have done,
That just seems like a given. I suppose, arguably, some would argue that the Remain campaign did provide impact assessment reports, and the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England, but that was all written off as Project Fear, and because some of them haven't come true, some people will cling to the notion that they were deliberately deceitful, and I suppose you could make a case for saying that Leavers did impact assessment reports as well by describing the sunny uplands into which we would be moving and the freedom to have our cake and eat it. I want to do another hour on this. Text me if that furiously annoys you. A couple of phone lines free, line 5 and line 10 to be precise. You can have them if you want. All you've got to do is dial 03456060973. And I've given up on the old magic eye analogy that I used to enjoy, this belief that if you stare at something for long enough, eventually the optical illusion will deliver. You remember those posters that were popular in the 80s? It was like a series of squiggles and wiggles, but if you looked at it in the right way and you could just get the right depth of vision, then a picture of the Taj Mahal would emerge in the background. A lot of our phone-ins together over the years have followed that model, and quite a lot of Taj Mahals have hoved into view while we're staring at the squiggles. But not on this, because David Davis is being touted as the next Prime Minister now by Brexiters, and yet he is so spectacularly unfit for purpose that it's frankly arguable that he should be allowed near scissors. Can you prove that, James? Yeah, well, I already have. I don't think anyone's arguing with the notion that David Davis is a disaster. And we should have spotted it. I did. I was a very lonely voice back then, in May of last year, when he said, after Brexit, the first port of call will be Berlin to do a trade deal, not Brussels. And people sort of said, because we were all on a crash course then, weren't we? People said then, well, hang on, you're not allowed to negotiate with individual member countries. Surely if you've been campaigning to leave, you must know that. But he clearly didn't. And Theresa May gave him the big job. Then there's this, which is remarkable. This is a Freedom of Information request from September of this year. Please could you supply electronic copies of the reports of each of the 57 studies referenced by David Davis MP in Q410 in this inquiry? And this was the reply that came to that. I can confirm that the Department for Exiting the European Union holds the information you have requested. This information is being withheld as exempt under sections 27, 29 and 35 of the Act, which protect information which may prejudice international relations, the UK economy and the policy development process, respectively. These exemptions are outlined further below. So you remember that argument. The impact assessments exist, but we can't publish them because it would weaken our negotiating position. And then yesterday, and he also said that Theresa May has read some of them, and then yesterday he said they never existed. So how can you be cheering him? Answer, because if I stop cheering him, I have to start wondering whether the whole thing is a disaster. Well, I'm not saying it necessarily is, but here is him speaking a while ago. This is David Davis.
Those of us on my side of the argument are quite clear in our minds. The access to the European market will be maintained, and access to other markets around the world will be increased. That's really much of the argument for leave.
And then on the impact assessments.
I'm being very clear about this. It's in my job, I don't think out loud, and I don't make guesses. Yeah? Those two things, I try to make decisions. You make those based on the data. That data is being gathered. We've got 50, nearly 60 sectoral analyses already done. We've got planning work going on the customs. We've got planning work going on 22 other issues which are critical, 127 all told. All of them have got to be grounded before we come to a conclusion what it looks like.
Okay, so can we ground them now before we come to a conclusion of what it looks like?
There's no sort of systematic impact assessment.
So the answer to the question is no.
Yeah.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications of leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
Not I'm aware of, no.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of, no.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer's going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right. Now, doesn't it strike you, Secretary of State, as rather strange, given experience around the committee in which you have, the government undertakes impact assessments on all sorts of things all of the time, that on the most fundamental change that we are facing as a country, you've just told us that the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments at all.
I'm not imagining this, am I? I'm not dreaming this. Look, apart from the most frothy-mouthed of trolls, who I don't think are ever going to sort of recognise reality, surely everybody listening to this programme at the moment shares my sense of horror at what we just heard, or what we heard yesterday. Do you know what I'd like to do? I'm tempted to clear the board and say, just ring me now if you don't feel horrified by what you just heard. How can you not be horrified by that? So here is the Secretary of State for leaving the European Union explaining the existence and importance of impact assessments.
I'm being very clear about this. It's in my job, I don't think out loud, and I don't make guesses. Yeah? Those two things, I try to make decisions. You make those based on the data. That data is being gathered. We've got 50, nearly 60 sectoral analyses already done. We've got planning work going on the customs. We've got planning work going on 22 other issues which are critical, 127 all told. All of them have got to be grounded before we come to a conclusion what it looks like.
All of them have to be grounded before we can come to a conclusion of what it looks like. He is describing economic modelling, which he said yesterday he thinks is a complete waste of time. But let's stick to the task in hand. Here is the same Secretary of State for leaving the European Union discussing the importance and existence of those impact assessments, which a moment ago you heard him describe as being utterly necessary before you can proceed even with leaving the European Union, let alone negotiating. Here he is yesterday addressing exactly the same issue.
There's no sort of systematic impact assessment.
So the answer to the question is no.
Yeah.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications for leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
Not I'm aware of, no.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of, no.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer's going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right.
It's the giggle that makes you want to punch someone, isn't it? Because he's still in charge. So in May 2016, he didn't know that you're not allowed to negotiate individually with European Union member countries. He thought and he said that our negotiator would go to Berlin, not Brussels. He didn't know that, and he's still in the job. He said that sectoral analyses were absolutely essential to coming up with any meaningful plan for negotiating. And then he said there weren't any, and he didn't need them, and he's still in the job. And why is the question I can't answer, because this is where the accusations of being condescending and sneering perhaps assume a troubling resonance, because how could anybody with a functioning intellect not be completely spooked by what they just heard? That was the sound of British democracy crumbling. That was the sound of a government minister directly contradicting himself in a House of Commons Select Committee, secure in the knowledge that the tidal wave of emotion and nativism would insulate him from individual ministerial responsibility, from parliamentary sovereignty. All of these things are under threat now, because a Secretary of State has directly contradicted himself. And he didn't get found guilty of contempt of Parliament because there are 10 Conservatives and a DUP MP sitting on that select committee. Wow. So, now you've heard that, what could make things better? 1111 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. If you're wondering what's on front pages today, I'll tell you of the major Brexit supporting newspapers. The Daily Express, beware 90-mile-per-hour killer storm. The Daily Mail, dead terrorists can't harm us. The Sun, Cal drives me crazy. But yesterday, the Secretary of State for leaving the European Union completely contradicted his own description of the importance of impact assessments, which would be forgivable. He'd be allowed to change his mind about how important they were. But when he offered up his original interpretation of how important they were, he not only acknowledged their existence, but he counted them. And yesterday he said there weren't any. Which leads me, employing Occam's razor, but not necessarily arriving at the right conclusion, just the one that most simply fits the available facts, to conclude that there are impact assessment reports, but they are so unspeakably awful that David Davis took a decision to look like a lying nincompoop as preferable to letting the British public see what the sectoral analyses he previously described as crucial and essential had actually discovered. And there is, I don't believe, any other explanation. If you look at civil servants on LinkedIn, believe it or not, some of them describe themselves as working on these analyses that he denied yesterday existed. So I know it sounds a tiny bit conspiratorial, but goodness me, given the madness that's unfolding on the other side of the fence, I think those of us on this side are allowed an occasional flight of fancy. What other reason can there be for him to acknowledge and explain their existence and importance, and then within months deny that they ever existed at all and utterly denigrate the notion that they were important or necessary? What other reason can there be? They never existed, so he was lying back then? That would just be weird. They did exist, and he was telling the truth back then, but then they arrived and he read them and he realised, oh my God, we can't let the public see this. The whole game will be up. So what's he doing? Filibustering until March 2019? They're just hanging on, hoping that the public won't wise up to what a disaster this is. But then I have another why I can't answer. Why? Who wins? This notion of disaster capitalism, shady billionaires queuing up to buy big chunks of the NHS and shower us with chlorinated chicken. I don't buy that. I don't see that. But, you know, given what's happened in America recently, I suppose sometimes those of us who sit here thinking there's no way the con is that big end up, in retrospect, feeling and looking rather foolish. 11:14 is the time. Chris is in Queen's Park. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, Chris. What's on your mind?
Basically, I mean, this whole sorry mess. This woman came on telly on the news yesterday, and she was one of the EU negotiators, and she made a point which reminded me of a fact which is seldom said. And she said, it seems like the British don't know what they want. Now, I think that's exactly right. They don't know what they want.
We want our country back.
Well, the whole exercise, since May got in and said Brexit means Brexit, the whole thing was an exercise to maintain that, whatever it might be, 5 or 10% of the electorate, working class Tories, who the Tories have always needed to retain power in this country. And because they knew if they went against the referendum, they'd be in danger of losing those votes on a domestic level, that is the only reason they've gone with this Brexit means Brexit. Never mind if the country goes down the pan, we can't lose those voters. Otherwise, we'll lose power going forward. That's what the whole thing's about. That's why David Davis is so confused. He's no idea what he wants. It's simply about keeping hold of those voters.
I like your analysis. I'm just going to leave it hanging for other people to respond to. 0345 6060 973. It makes sense. It fits the facts, and I need theories that fit the facts. Why? Well, because I don't believe in unicorns. So maybe we'll examine that suggestion. The impact assessments must exist because David Davis's department confirmed that they did, and he spoke about them himself. So why now pretend that they don't? Oh, or just sort of lend me your rose-tinted spectacles, because God knows I need them. Kevin is in Grimsby. Grimsby. Kevin, what would you like to say?
How are you, James?
Very good, Kevin. How are you?
Oh, James,
Kevin.
When you talk about Brexit, it brings all the Christmas cheer out and all the Ramoners, doesn't it?
Everybody rational is going to be a little bit worried about David Davis saying that these analyses were really, really important and that there were 58 of them and that he can't really do his job until they've all been completed, and then saying 3 months later that they never existed at all and he doesn't need anything like that. That's not a Ramona.
You know what? He's probably sat and thought, I wish I'd have just kept my mouth shut and basically not even mentioned about these impact statements.
Right.
I voted to leave, right? And I voted to leave as one of the normal guys on the street.
Yes.
When I ticked that box, get out of the EU, I ticked, I don't want to be paying any more money. I'm sick and tired of the immigration issue that we've got. There's not being a member of the EU benefits me not. I came on after the commercial break, and one of the commercials.
Not really allowed to talk about the adverts on the radio. There's rules about it. I don't know whether you're going to say anything that would break those rules, but I'd rather not risk it if it's all right with you.
Society, we've got a problem where we're struggling to look after our own people, and when we were a member of the EU, we still have this problem. Being out of the EU, we're still going to have this problem. So, as far as I'm concerned, David Davis is not the man to get there. But then again...
To get where, Kevin?
Sorry?
To get where? He's not the man to get there, you said. To get where?
He's not the man to do any negotiations or anything. But from the layman's terms, from my perspective, I'm only interested in two things. Get that letter handed over to say we're getting out, which was perfect, that was done. And now we've got, we need to negotiate this, we need to negotiate that. No, we don't. The figures that were just released in the car industry, car sales were down. We're still in the EU. They're down. They're going to still be down when we leave the EU. Nothing's going to change. And then they'll go back up.
Do you read the Grimsby Evening... Do you read the Grimsby Telegraph?
Well, do you know what? If I'm having a really happy day, I'll read it to get depressed.
Did you... Well, that's what the news does to sensible people, so don't feel bad about that. Did you see the report about the delegation from the Lincolnshire food industry going to Westminster?
Right. No, I never, but my wife probably does because she's...
This was where they called upon the government to provide Grimsby with exemptions from Brexit. The seafood should be given a special free trade status to ensure that the town's not damaged. And some of the detail in it was because companies like Young's and Icelandic Sea Chill, the biggest employers in Grimsby, they import 90% of the fish they process, which would automatically become subject to tariffs if we don't get our finger out quickly. They predicted a 20% labour shortfall as a result of Brexit. These are the people running the seafood industry in your hometown. They talked about the delays in fresh fish reaching the town's factories, import fees. A chap called Simon Dwyer, who speaks for the Seafood Grimsby and Humber cluster group representing the industry, biggest employer in your town, of course, called on the government to look at bestowing free trade status on the ports of Immingham and Grimsby itself in relation to seafood. Because, of course, customs checks and import tariffs on seafood coming in or out of those ports would, in the words of the people that run the industry, possibly destroy it.
Well, this is where good management comes in when you run a business, because I run a business.
They do run it.
When you're affected by things...
They do run it.
Yeah, I know, but...
They run the fishing industry in your hometown, and they're describing Brexit as something they desperately need to be excused from.
I understand that, but what will happen is if it is affected when things take place, they'll sit around a table and they will figure a way around it.
Okay.
I mean, but as far as I'm concerned, in the normal...
You mean like David Davis is doing at the moment?
David, the people in the government couldn't run a pub, let alone run the government. But
But the people in the industry who say, please don't do this, they should be the ones who are forced to do it.
Look, that's where you've got your for and against, and that's where...
No, that's the fishing industry in your hometown. I know nothing about fishing. I discovered that 90% of the fish that comes into your hometown is imported from the European Union. I didn't know that. You probably didn't either. So the people that run the biggest employers in your hometown are saying, please don't make us do this. And you say it's all right, they'll all sit around a table.
I used to live in Cleethorpes, and I used to see the lorries coming in delivering the fish from Aberdeen, down to the docks.
Yeah.
It just wasn't... It's not just...
How does that address what the fellas who run Youngs and Seachill have said, the fact that you used to see some lorries in Cleethorpes, Kevin?
Say that? No, lorries from Scotland delivering fish.
When you lived in Cleethorpes. That would presumably be the 10% that's not imported, wouldn't it?
No, well, you know what? There'll always be fish coming in. They'll resolve it. But what I'm trying to say to you is, from the guy on the street's perspective...
The guy on the street works for these companies, Kevin. The guy on the street works for these companies whose bosses are saying Brexit is going to be a disaster for your hometown.
I totally understand what you're saying, but see the guy in the street that voted Leave? He's no interested in that issue.
Well, whether he's got a job or not next year.
What affects us, right? And what affects
it's his employer describing the possibility of going out of business. How can that not affect him?
Well, do you know what? Maybe the government can put some of that money in to the fishing industry.
But we've just established that you think the government is unfit for purpose, Kevin. That was your own observation at the beginning of this call.
The people that are running the government are unfit for purpose. I think.
But you want them to come to the rescue. You just said.
No, I don't. No, I don't want them people to come to the rescue. What I'm saying is the 50 million that they were paying into the EU, I'm sure they can divert some of that cash in to help the fishing industry.
No, they can't, because they've got to settle our bills with the European Union. Otherwise, on the world stage, our ability to strike trade deals, we'll look like shirkers. We'll look like con men.
You don't need to pay money to get a trade deal. You do that with discussion on a table.
Can you name one trade deal on the planet that doesn't involve finances?
Cars.
Pardon?
Cars, vehicles.
What do you mean?
The vehicles that are made...
I said name a trade deal, so you need to say something like NAFTA, or you need to say something like SECA.
I'm giving you a trade, the car industry. The cars that are made in this country, we buy some of the parts from the EU. And part of the
tariff-free, at the moment tariff-free, because we're in a trade deal.
If they decide we're going to put a tariff on, then we'll just put one back.
Oh, mate, do you know why we've got a tariff-free trade with the European Union?
Yeah, because we pay 50 million a day to be in the club.
We pay 50 million pounds a day to be in the club.
Yeah, we don't get it for free.
Oh, I can't. Let's just shake hands and say goodbye, Kev.
Are you not aware that we pay money to be in this club, and that's why we get?
That's why it's a trade agreement. You're supposed to be telling me about the trade agreements that you don't have to pay to be in, Kevin, and you've just described one that you do have to pay.
From the layman, I'm trying to talk from the person on the street, right?
Whose boss has said Brexit could close our business in Grimsby.
Let me put it this way. When we're in the EU, your pay packet doesn't change. See, when we're at the EU...
Mate, it's already gone down by 15%, your pay packet, since we voted to leave.
Mine's hasn't. My business has increased.
You're not paid in pounds?
Yes, I'm paid in pounds.
And that pound is worth 15% less than it was before the vote. And most of the economic modelling is...
The pound was going down against the euro.
And the dollar, and every currency on the planet.
7 years ago, because I was doing business in Spain 7 years ago, and it went from 125 down to 117, and it's been down ever since.
Yes.
And that was way before we decided to have a referendum.
Yes, currencies fluctuate all the time, but there's not a single person in the world who doesn't credit the collapse in the pound after Brexit to the referendum result, except perhaps you, my friend.
It's a 100% responsible thing because of it.
Okay, so anyway, just to clarify, the trade deal that doesn't involve paying, can you just run me by what that looks like, where it is?
What do you mean the trade deal?
The one that you were talking about a minute ago when you said you can have lots of trade agreements without paying membership fees.
How did it work before we were in the EU? Did it not work then?
People could still do trade, Kevin, but they had tariffs. And they had to, mate. Let's just leave it, shall we?
We're in the 21st century, James.
Pardon?
We're in the 21st century.
Well done, Kevin. Finally, something we can agree on.
Right, listen.
I am listening, Kevin.
Listen, what I'm trying to say is that the guy on the street that voted Leave, which was me, right? The reason that I voted leave wasn't it because of trade deals, wasn't it because of, how much money we think we might get out of it or whatever. There's only a couple of reasons I voted leave. One, we're paying all this money into the EU, and the guy on the street that's in austerity benefits not, right?
He's got a job.
Well, we're sick of it, right?
And the biggest employer in Grimsby has said that job is now under threat.
Well, do you know what?
So you're telling me, this is quite patronising, my friend, you're telling me that the ordinary man on the street in Grimsby deliberately voted to endanger his own livelihood?
No, sir. But listen, you're talking... What about all the self-employed people and all this, the other...
Why are you talking about them now? It's almost as if every time you say something, I respond to it and you move on to something else. What was reason 2, Kevin? Because reason 1 has boiled down to the ordinary man on the street in Grimsby.
Let me give you another example.
No, just give me reason 2, Kevin.
I know a girl that's just got a job in the hospital. She gave up a career she had in care. She went to work in the hospital. 3 weeks later, she was told, by the way, 7 years are in here. We only need 2 of you now because Virgin Health have decided that they're taking over and they want rid of you. She now needs to lose her job. Where's the EU help there?
You got me, mate. That's it. That's a brilliant reason to vote to leave the European Union.
No, I'm giving you my personal reason.
I know, and I'm saying it's a brilliant personal reason.
I'm sick of the immigration issues.
Yeah.
I'm sick and tired of 50 million a day in this club that's corrupt. Yes,
that's fine. I've got no beef with you. I think you should say thank you to me for making you aware of what the biggest employers in your hometown say about it all.
Well, great. Do you know what?
Just a simple thank you, and then we can have the news headlines.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't affect me as far as Young's is concerned.
Okay, but you are in Grimsby, and it is the seafood industry, and most people see a link between the two. But hey, you keep talking to the ordinary man in the street who lives in Grimsby but doesn't care about the seafood industry. Fish. Mystery Hour's on the way at 12, although I don't know whether light relief would necessarily be the correct phrase to describe what it will offer up at the moment. Thank you, Annette. I shall read this out because it is something that addresses a criticism I've taken to heart over the years. She writes, "Well done, James. There was a time when you would have torn that last caller to pieces in a brutal way. Now your calm, if exasperated approach understandably allowed all to see the idiocy of his argument." I wish you were right, Annette. But of course it didn't allow all to see the idiocy of the poor fella's argument. Not least him. Brunel is in Chingford. Brunel, what's going on? What are we doing? What happens next? Answer any question you want, even when I haven't asked.
Hello, James. You know what? At the risk of sounding patronising, I'm just going to ignore your last caller and bypass that one. I think I'm going to keep it nice and simple. I think David Davis is a liar and should be out of his job because he's been lying because obviously at the time when he said he was taking into account the impact of leaving the EU, either he was telling the truth then and he was doing that, and now he's lying, depending on the results he has seen, or he was lying then and he wasn't doing the report anyway. Either way, it is not. It's a bad thing. He shouldn't have done it at all. And I think the idea that you wouldn't even look into the impact of the economy after leaving the EU, it's mind-boggling. I can't even imagine why you wouldn't do something like that. And to lie about it and not give people the truth of it, because I think I was a Remainer. But I accept that we live in a democracy, and we've voted to leave, irrespective of the reason. You know what?
I don't know that I can agree with you on that, because increasingly it seems to me that if it's a bit like saying, I'm going to sell you a scale electric in its box, okay?
Yeah.
And you now vote on whether or not you want to buy the scale electric in this box, which I haven't opened. Right, and it's 52%, 48% say yes, we're going to buy it. So I give you the box, and you open it, and it's got I don't know, some old toenail clippings in it, and I say, yeah, but you voted to buy it, and then you say, yeah, but you told me there was a scale electric in it. I said, yeah, but you didn't check, and you voted to buy it. I don't know that I do. I hear it a lot. I hear it a lot from people who I won't name, but quite prominent people who in private now admit that it is absolutely disastrous, but still cling in public to the notion that the will of the people somehow has to be met. The people did not vote for all of the stuff that's going to happen to them. They voted for stuff they were promised that is not going to be delivered.
To be honest, I know a few of the people similar to the last caller.
Yeah.
And to be honest, they should have asked. These are the questions I asked myself. I asked my friends and said, okay, we vote to leave the EU. What happens the next day? What then? They said, we'll sort it out then. They were not interested. I'm telling you, that's what they said. We'll sort it, we'll work it out. The excuse of saying, well, you think German people are going to stop selling their cars to us? And I said, well, okay, maybe that's an aspect of it. But think of it this way. Could this country afford to lose all those people who work in those showrooms? Will the English people stop buying German cars? The answer is no. They didn't want to ask any questions. They didn't want to look into anything further than what their thoughts were when it came to the EU. They were convinced that it was all, the fault of the EU. Basically, the campaign against the EU had been going on for good at least 10 years.
30.
And so many people just wanted the confirmation of what they already believed, just like the gentleman now. And that's all they wanted. They didn't want to think about.
So what are we going to do? How do we make it better? How do we make it better? I mean, how can we? Is it a stupid question to ask because David Davis is still in the job after?
I think we can't. I think what we need to look at is, well, whatever happens, if things turn out to be fantastic, that's great. If things turn out to go pear-shaped, then there's light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe in 10 years' time, or whatever happens, inevitably things will get better. I think that's the only thing that you can really realistically look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, things are going to get worse before they can get better, though.
They do.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I asked my friends. I said, "Are you willing to look at your neighbour and say, well, it doesn't matter if you're suffering now and you lose your job and you lose your home. Well, all that matters is that we've got control of our borders, and in a few years' time,
which we already
have
have
a home afterwards."
Yeah.
So exactly. So that's why I kept asking, are you willing to look at your neighbour and say that to them? At least we've got our borders. So if you suffer, it doesn't matter. So people said, "Oh, don't worry, you're just exaggerating. You're scaremongering."
Why does the needle stay so straight though? Because I'm uncomfortable with the conclusion that really, when you strip everything away, we were carried over the line by people who are concerned about immigration or xenophobic, whichever way you want to phrase it. There are plenty of people who are concerned about immigration who are not xenophobic, but even those concerns seem to me to be largely illegitimate, and they're a lot higher. I had that awful phone in a couple of weeks ago when people were describing falling out with their own family members because their grandmother lives in a little village in Suffolk and never meets any foreign people, and she's convinced that the country is drowning under the weight of immigration. You never really hear those arguments from people living in the big cities. It's strange.
I live in London, and I had those arguments. We had arguments indoors where we went days without talking because, for me, all I kept asking them was, that's your idea, and I don't necessarily think that there is an issue.
But is that all that we're going to be left with? When we've unpicked all of this, when we've unpacked it all, it is just going to be... Because poor old Kevin, the idea that leaving the European Union is going to somehow prevent further privatisation of the NHS is... It's heartbreaking. No, don't laugh. Don't laugh. It's heartbreakingly naive, but he's a sincere guy. But apart from that, it's two calls today.
It's the Trumpian thing, where you want something different, but you don't look into just who it is that you want to put in power. You don't want to pay attention to what that person really truly represents and what that person has done in the past. You're convinced that you want something different. Whatever you've got is not working, so you need something that's different. And at that point in time,
anything different.
What's different, it makes a sense.
That was Billy in the Isle of Wight, wasn't it, earlier, when he just said, "I wanted a change, James. I wanted a change." I like Billy. But that idea of what did you want to change? You want to stay in the single market? You haven't got a problem with immigration? I just wanted a change. And then old Kevin in Grimsby complaining about how much the EU interferes in the UK, and then complaining that the EU hadn't interfered enough when his friend got made redundant or got the flick from the NHS. 11:43 is the time. I am a bit despondent, actually. Thank you for people who are expressing a little bit of concern for me. I'm despondent because however odd this sounds and however much sort of fury it stokes in the hearts of people who hate mirrors and hate me for holding them up, I love Kevin in Grimsby. And I think that the benefits of... I don't know what word I'm looking for. I think that if you have a job that involves looking at evidence and thinking about stuff before you arrive at your conclusions, you have an actual responsibility, I'd say almost a patriotic duty, to keep the public informed. And when I hear someone so furiously uninformed, it breaks my heart. And I don't know what my profession has done. Well, I do, actually. My profession's probably done more to create that confusion than any other. But it's not. There's no, oh yeah, what a dork. None of that. I maybe fell into that trap a couple of years ago, but now it's just sad. It's sad, and the only other alternative to sadness is anger. There's nothing else. What else do you do when the Secretary of State for leaving the European Union directly and demonstrably contradicts himself? How do you do it? You get angry, and that doesn't help because everyone else is already angry. And the alternative is to get sad, or just to forget about the whole thing and start talking about scale X-trick. Maybe we should just start talking about scale X-trick. It's a lot of fun. And thank you as well for all the people pleased by my correct pronunciation of that word. It's coming up to 11:45. I'll take a couple more calls on this. I don't know if you can... Actually, Brunel just vacated one phone line, so you can grab that if you're very, very quick. We could carry on with this for another 12 hours, but we won't because it's Thursday. Miss Chair is on the way at 12 and Sheila Fogarty is on the way at 1. So we'll probably wait until tomorrow. I wonder what we'll be talking about tomorrow. What Boris Johnson is delivering a speech at the moment. Boris Johnson is still Foreign Secretary, despite having personally imperilled the life and the safety of a British citizen in a foreign jail. It just doesn't really make any sense anymore. It's 11:45. We need to find a kind of new common ground, don't we? Or some sort of... the problem is it would involve agreeing, starting on points of agreement. And if the point of agreement is that the Brexit negotiations are going disastrously, I think does everyone agree on that? Does some people... No, Kwasi Kwarteng on Newsnight the other night claimed they were going really well. I started on the morning after the referendum by trying to find something we could all agree on. And I think that was the last time. I said nobody really knows what happens next. But even then we got calls telling us exactly what was going to happen next. And absolutely none of it came true. I wonder quite how we've ended up in a place where David Davis can directly contradict himself in such an egregious way and still be in the job. Matt Chorley's rather good in the Times today. I read it online. I don't know if it's in the print edition. He questions whether or not David Davis himself actually exists. He's sort of been pursuing the notion that this whole process is performance art, and he writes that the installation took a surreal turn yesterday, twisting the concept of existence in 21st century Whitehall in what one can only assume is a late entry for the Turner Prize. Then lists all the times he described these reports, and then yesterday said they never existed at all. Ho-hum, Stevie is in Edinburgh. Stevie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'd like to say that I think that the existence or the non-existence of these reports shows that it's purely an ideologically driven thing that they're up to.
But what's the ideology? What's the end? What's the goal? What do they want?
I think it's clear for all to see that it's kind of a harking back to a previous time or a previous world where British people or English people kind of ruled the roost, and we'll get this trade deal and we'll go overseas and do this, and it just doesn't exist anymore. And I think much like other dangerous ideologies, it's twisted and manipulated to suit that particular day, and Davis proved that yesterday.
Give me a bit more flesh, if you will, because I know what you're referring to. You're referring to a kind of a sort of delusional view of Britain's role in the world. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of specifics, what's the ideology? So we come out. Are you going down there'll be, low regulation, low workplace? It's the Chicago School of Economics. Is that the ideology you're going after, whereby there's not really any such thing as an employee? The employer has no rights and responsibilities. A sort of Hayek and Friedman school of thought, where you just have this utterly craven workforce who are so poorly protected and poorly paid, they'll do whatever the hell the bosses want.
Which is already in existence now, obviously.
We're getting there. But you honestly believe that? Because I don't. I probably go to church too much. I can't see people as being that cruel. I look at the front page and I see incompetence and I see dishonesty and self-preservation and ego. But I don't see people who want to return to the sort of 19th century concepts of mill owners and master sweeps.
I think that I do. What I also think is what Kevin so beautifully demonstrated is that it's other people are. It's a perfect storm.
Yeah.
Because it feeds into that. Let's close our borders, and you're English, mate. You should be getting a better deal out of this.
Yeah.
You're the leader of the world. It's fed into that. And the Tories are making it up as they go along, but we've already knew that.
The
Scottish government here produced a report into the impact of Brexit on Scotland, published it. Why can't these guys do the same? And now they don't exist at all. Was it not 2 weeks ago that they say that they could be viewed by MPs, heavily edited versions in a library, and now they don't exist at all.
Yeah. I mean, but then, you know, all of these moments have mounted up. Because for me, it was the 26th of May when he said after Brexit, the first port of call for the UK's negotiator will be Berlin, not Brussels. Displaying, I mean, a frankly, almost unbelievable level of ignorance of how it works, and yet he's in charge of getting us out. So it's just another piece of evidence, and that's where I get really confused. And it used to be in quite a nice way, because it was like an academic conundrum or a riddle that we were all working on together. But now it's slightly frightening, because you have utterly irresistible evidence that the man in charge of the whole process is, at the very best, a clown, and at the very worst, a liar.
Yeah.
And people, there is no other analysis. There is no other analysis, and yet people still have the blinkers on. People, and do you know what really hacks me off when I get a call like Kevin's? Is all the cowards, all the keyboard warriors who'll say that he was sort of cherry-picked, or they only let on all the people who haven't got the guts to ring in and try and make the arguments that Kevin made a passionate attempt to make. He just perhaps lacked the knowledge and understanding to make it as passionately as he wanted to, and then all the sort of cowards and trolls in the background start abusing him. That's what really hacks me off, because that makes me wonder what unity is ever going to look like again. Because here's someone making your case for you, but because he's exposed himself to the scrutiny of in this case, a journalist, and it all falls apart, you're going to hate him and you're going to hate the journalist. You're not going to hate the case that you still subscribe to. That's the thing that baffles me now.
And also, that your show at this time tomorrow will be talking about something completely different that a Tory minister has done, said, unsaid, rewritten, things like that. So the government know that this is just this continual process of day-long...
It seems to be. So this is where the theory that Davis has embarked upon, a filibuster just to keep the hot air coming out until March 2019, and then when it becomes truly and irrevocably irreversible, then it's mission accomplished. But I still don't know what the mission is, or what the hope is. Exploitation and oppression of workers? I don't know. I don't want to believe that. It's 11:55. Stevie, thank you. Martin's in Penrith. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm trying to calm down after listening to Kevin. I was driving and had to pull over.
Just as well. You're in a lovely part of the world, though, so at least the view was nice when you pulled over, Martin.
That's very true. James, I deliver said fish that you were discussing earlier on, both UK and Europe, and it astounded me when I read the other week that Grimsby, I think it was 72% leave.
It was a huge vote to leave, yeah.
Huge, over 2/3. And then all of a sudden, but hold on, our fish. Well, sorry, but you've made the decision, so, you know.
Could you see it coming? I was slightly surprised. I say I'm no expert on this, although I know more every day than I did yesterday. Did you see it coming, the problems that the fish industry would have, given that you work in it?
Yes.
God.
I'm kind of in terms of the trucking community, I'm kind of what's the word I'm looking for?
A rarity.
I would say, a rarity. Most of them seem to be Brexiteers or Brexists or whatever you want.
And they're delivering domestically, are they? Or are they crossing to the continent as well?
No, they're going to the continent as well. I mean...
But they're going to be sitting in Dover for 2 hours every job they do soon, and if we don't pull our finger out.
It'll be a lot longer than 2 hours, James, and I can assure you. Well, I'd actually jotted that, because I'm not great at public speaking, so I'd actually jotted down...
Just me. It's only me. Go on. Take your time, Martin.
Right. The UK Border Agency at Calais, because obviously when you get back to the Eurotunnel on the French side, you're going in, that's the English border there, or the UK border there, so you're speaking to English guys and girls on that side.
That's right, yeah.
Straight away, yeah, before you go through the tunnel.
Yes.
We're supposed to have an open border within the EU. They can't manage that. How are they going to manage along with customs as well?
I don't know, mate.
You know, I've seen me sitting on the motorway at Calais for up to 6 hours.
Yeah.
Just to get in, you know, and equally at this end...
This is the border we can't control, where you have to sit for 6 hours just to get in.
Aye, absolutely.
The border that doesn't exist. The border that lets terrorists waltz in whenever they want, but you have to sit there waiting for 6 hours.
But to go back to the fish, if I can, just quickly, obviously Grimsby, that's their only import and export. We bring quite a lot of the fish down from obviously north of the border, and it gets processed, right?
Yeah.
And equally, we bring a lot of fish in from France and from Holland, Belgium, beg your pardon, Breskens. And I had said to your producer there, if I'm not going abroad, I'll be doing a Heathrow run, which is basically from Glasgow to Heathrow, and there's probably, I would say, anywhere, depending on volumes, anywhere between 5 to maybe 15 articulated lorries a night going to Heathrow, and all of that fish is export. Every last one of them is export, and it's either going to North America or Japan or Canada or wherever. And if you miss that flight, I'll give you an example. I totally hold my hands up to it. I fell asleep a few weeks ago while I was on my break on the way down, and I only just made it. You know, the cut-off.
I understand you. Yeah.
Is about
So there's no wiggle room when you've got a lorry load of fish in the back. There's no kind of 6 hours sitting in a queue could impact upon your entire cargo. That's what you're telling me, because we're going to run out of time.
Yes, aye, definitely.
Good man.
Looking at a 10 grand. You're looking at a 10 grand fine for fish missing its flight. You know,
£10,000 a pop every time.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's what the man on the street in Grimsby wanted, Martin. And who are we to tell him that possibly when he unwraps that box, he's not going to be very pleased with what he finds inside?